When I say personal brand, what do you think of? Kim Kardashian, Elon Musk, Donald Trump?
If you have to ask yourself what your personal brand is, then you don't have a personal brand. A personal brand is something that's very intentional.
Love it or hate it, you're probably aware of the term by now. Carlii Lyon is a personal branding and reputation expert. She's worked with people like Miranda Kerr to put themselves out there in the best possible way. Carlii shares a simple mental model to curate your personal brand with intention.
I use a framework which is promise, packaging, positioning, and promotion. What do you want people to reliably expect from you? What's your profile image saying about you? Where are you showing up and who are you showing up with?
She even audits my personal brand in real time on the show. This is really hard.
Yes.
Carlii explains the fundamental trap we all fall into when we think about thought leadership.
We unfortunately have this misleading myth that when we are good enough, that's when we'll be asked to speak, or that's when people will invite us onto their podcasts. And that's just the wrong way to approach it.
She's one of the few people I've met who really owns her role as a thought leader. Do you see yourself as a thought leader?
I do. Yeah, I do.
Learn how she built the courage to become a thought leader, starting with a single article in 2018. Welcome to The Thought Follower. I'm Joe Mackay. I've always had a lot of questions about life, and this show is my quest to find some answers. Each week, I'll chat to a thought leader to hear what's going on in their space. Let's jump into the next episode. My guest on the show today is a personal branding and reputation expert. She's a regular contributor to Forbes Australia, and for over 15 years, she's been helping people to proactively cultivate their professional identities. Carlii Lyon, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe.
I'd love to jump straight in. This idea of personal brand, maybe it's just for me in my circles lately, has become very topical. You've been in this space for a long time. How do you define a personal brand and why does it matter?
Yeah, it's been so interesting, this term personal branding, even though it was coined in 1997, which was a long time, even really before the emergence of social media and the popularity of social media, it really has come to the forefront in recent times. I have been in this space for a long time, but what's interesting is I've only been using the term personal brand in the past 5 years. So how I would define a personal brand is how an individual intentionally presents and packages who they are and what they do for a purpose. And Joe, I've always made a point of saying that if you have to ask yourself what your personal brand is, then you don't have a personal brand. You might have a reputation, and that may be something that you haven't even intentionally shaped. It's just happened as you've gone through your career. But a personal brand is something that's very intentional. So you've really had to have taken the time to think about, well, who am I? What do I stand for? Who do I want to speak to? And how am I putting myself out there to make sure that I'm getting out to those people?
So I think about this from a more broad marketing sense. This one definition of a brand is around, what people say about you when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
And I think that really talks to the point you mentioned about the intent. You will have a reputation. People will have an opinion about you, I guess, whether you're curating that or not.
Yeah.
And I think you can kind of even expand the definition, especially now with social media, when you're not in the room, but also even long before you've even entered the room. We've never spoken before right now, but I follow you on LinkedIn. I've found you on some podcasts on YouTube and things like that. Like there's all that opportunity for people now to form that opinion. And that first impression that people are making isn't always within their control, I guess, unless they are applying it with intent.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I remember a story that Stephen Bartlett was telling about the power of personal branding, and he was pitching to a client, and then after the pitch, the client pulled him aside and said, "Can I get your autograph?" And he was like, that's the power of a personal brand. And I just love that story because it goes back to what you're saying, that absolutely you're shaping that impression before you've even entered the room, before you've even met that person. So yeah, the applications are very widespread and so relevant and important, especially in the world that we're living in today.
And so this is a random tidbit in some of that kind of investigation that I was doing. I noticed that you changed your name.
Yes.
Was that just after high school? Was that the start of your kind of intentional personal branding?
In hindsight, it was. It wasn't at the time what I was thinking about. I think I was early 20s anyway. But it wasn't because I was thinking, oh, I want to change my brand. I want people to see me differently. It was because I was shaping my own identity within and didn't feel like the name I had matched who I wanted to be.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy now that I think about it. I've got kids now and I think, God, imagine if they changed their name. And I actually went all the way. So I changed my name on my birth certificate. So it's
wow.
It's on all of my documents now. So it's a pretty big thing to do. But that was the power of my belief at the time around numerology and what that stands for. And I consulted with a famous numerologist in the UK who has since passed away. And his whole thing was helping people choose their names. And he actually worked with a lot of celebrities who were creating their stage names. And so that was how I heard of him originally, because I was in the world of working with models, and a famous model had used him to change her name. So it didn't have that impact on me, Joe. I didn't end up on the cover of magazines, but it definitely helped shape the way I saw myself, which I think is a big part of the equation when it comes to personal branding.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Something that I help people with is fear of posting online. And so much of that comes with not necessarily being confident in yourself. It might be imposter syndrome or whatever you label it as. But I think whatever people can do to feel more comfortable sharing that, I think is so important. So where do we start? Like, let's say we've acknowledged we have a personal brand, whether we are curating it or not. We take that leap and we want to start being intentional about it. And I know you do personal brand audits for people. What's the starting point?
The starting point is to really understand what the end point is. Wherever you are right now, you do need to be aware of where you want to go. So I always have my clients think about, what are we aiming for in the next 3 to 5 years? What are you doing in 3 to 5 years? What do you want people to remember about you in 3 to 5 years? And we reverse engineer the process. And that helps people really use that as a benchmark to see, okay, well, in 3 years, I want to be known for XYZ, but I'm not mentioning that anywhere right now. I'm not even giving clues to that in any of my communication assets. So that's something that we would ultimately change. So starting with the end in mind, knowing where you want to go, using that as the benchmark, and understanding that personal branding and building that reputation is not a short-term activity. It is a long-term mindset. It does take time. So you really need to be sure that what you're putting out there today is resonating with where you want to go. So that is absolutely step one. Step two is I use a framework, which is very much a traditional framework of brand marketing, which is promise, packaging, positioning, and promotion. So first we need to think about, well, what's your promise? What do you want people to be able to reliably expect from you? So that's your promise. Your packaging is, how are you packaging yourself? So then we look at, what are your communication assets? What's your profile image saying about you? What's your bio saying about you? What's your styling saying about you? So that's your packaging. Your positioning is really looking at, where are you showing up and who are you showing up with? We understand the power of positioning with a product. I always use the example of a beautiful bottle of Chanel perfume. And I said, well, would you ever expect to see a beautiful bottle of Chanel perfume in the toothpaste section? And obviously we wouldn't. That would change the complete experience that you would have with that product. So positioning is really important. And then the last piece is promotion. And this is where I think a lot of people fall over in the personal branding journey, because we unfortunately have this underlying belief or this misleading myth that when we are good enough, that's when we'll be asked to speak, or that's when the media are going to reach out and ask us to contribute, or when we're good enough, that's when people will invite us onto their podcasts. And that's just the wrong way to approach it. If I think back to my clients in PR, they actually employed someone like me to knock on doors, to seek those opportunities. They were invested in that way, but it didn't just happen. It was proactively sought after.
Of the 4 parts, I'm really interested in packaging because some of the conflict that I've had around personal branding has been, how do you make it so that it's not a superficial thing? How do you go deeper than what I wear, my haircut, things like that? My engagement with your personal brand, it's very clear. You've got your look and it's across all your channels. It is clearly very curated. And so when I see that, I kind of think that feels exhausting as well. Like, is that, talk to me more about the packaging side of things and how we kind of get into that.
You know, I'm so glad that you've put that out there. Again, it comes back to that starting with the end in mind. So if you want your brand to be perceived as very real, very approachable, very raw, then that's the benchmark that you need to be working from. So yes, my brand might come across as very polished. There's a very clear look and feel and aesthetic. That is very intentional. But I tend to think that even if you're on the other end of the spectrum where you want it to be very raw, authentic, it's still as intentional because you're probably going out of your way to make sure that you're not the other.
Yep.
And on the point of it being exhausting, well, it's really the same amount of effort because, okay, yes, maybe in some of the photography, I've had to make more of an effort to put on hair and makeup and do the styling component. But what's important, Joe, is that it's true to who you are and what you want to be. And that's where I think there's no wrong and right with personal branding. I really do believe that you can do it your way as long as it's intentional and thought through, then that's what makes the difference.
What does that, the 3 to 5 year endpoint, look like for you?
For me, I'm really clear that I want to do a lot more speaking. I want to continue to do what I'm doing, but with bigger audiences and on bigger platforms.
My observation of your personal brand, it's distinctive by showing up regularly and consistently the same way. That association is happening. It's definitely noticeable. Like I said, we've never spoken before today. And this is probably your stock and trade. So it's part of the approach. You need to show up that way and lead by example, I guess.
Yeah, well, thank you. I take that as a huge compliment. And it's easy to be consistent when you have that clarity because you've created a clear framework of what you want, what you're saying. And if you've got those anchor points in place, then you're not having to constantly question, is this on brand? Is this not on brand? Am I doing this right? Am I doing it wrong? And look, there'll come a time inevitably for everyone where even for myself to go to the next level, there'll be some changes I need to make, different things I need to try. And I'll go back through an experimenting process and see what works in the next phase of my brand. And that applies to everyone anywhere, no matter what level they reach. You know, I always say it's easy to look at someone who's built a big audience and think, oh, they've done it, they've got there. But the reality is once you build that audience, once you build that reach, once you build that notoriety, it's just as much, if not more work to keep it. It's why the biggest brands are the biggest promoters of their brands. They spend the most money on advertising. It would be easy to say, well, someone like Chanel or McDonald's, stop advertising now because they're so iconic, they're so well known. But that's just not the case. You get to that point, but then there's a whole nother set of skills, things you have to do to stay at that point. So it is an ever-evolving journey.
Hey, it's Joe here. I hope you're enjoying the episode. Every chat in season 1 of The Thought Follower is very different. I've talked to creatives, economists, elite athletes, CEOs, venture capitalists, and a bunch more along the way. You never quite know what you're going to get, so make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts and make sure you don't miss an episode. Let's get back to the chat. Could we maybe flip it around? And I haven't gone through your process and mapped out I guess to an extent, I am intentional about how I want to show up and present my personal brand for sure. But if you were to do an audit on my personal brand that you've been exposed to, what jumps out to you?
So I can't make any comment until I know where you want to go.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I've got to put you on the spot now and really understand, well, what is it that you're actually trying to achieve? So let's make it a 3-year framework so that you don't have to think too far ahead. If we think about your promise, okay, being what people can come to reliably expect and depend on from you as a personal brand. And if we broke that promise up into an energetic promise and an intellectual promise. Energetic being, how do you want people to feel when they encounter you? And then the intellectual promise is, what do you want them to think of when they encounter you? So let's start there, and then I can give you some feedback on your brand.
This is really hard. So I think in the energy side of things, a lot of people will say, for me in a work context, that I tend to be relaxed about stuff.
Yeah.
I tend to lower the tension in situations rather than escalating. Internally, there is a lot of head noise. There is a lot of stuff going on, but I'm certainly always trying to apply perspective to like whatever's happening and show up with kind of positive and relaxed energy, I think.
Beautiful.
In terms of the intellectual promise, look, I think I was definitely kind of a nerd growing up. Like academically did well and think deeply about things. I do overanalyze things and really try and get into the why behind the why on things. And I think people would observe from me that I'm a deep thinker, and often, and probably it's in the context now of what I'm doing around hosting a podcast, but I will ask thought-provoking questions. I will get people thinking about things in a different way. I think that's probably, from an intellectual point of view, that's what I'd say about myself.
So what would you want people coming to the intellectual promise? What would you want people to think? So, for example, my intellectual promise is personal branding, reputation, identity. I want them to think of those words very clearly and quickly when they think of my name. So what would that be for you?
Well, I'm a ghostwriter. Like, I'm doing a lot of copywriting and ghostwriting for clients. So I think being known as a writer, I guess, someone who can turn complex thoughts into simple words. I try to do that by asking a lot of questions. I'm the person that will sit and ask you a whole bunch of questions about something that might feel quite minute, to try and understand more.
I love that. So ghostwriter?
Yeah.
Is there any particular industry?
Not yet. I need to figure that out.
Okay, so that's important. And then when you think about that, starting with the end in mind, what are you doing in 3 years?
I'm actually going solo, like full-time, into my freelancing as of January 2024.
Amazing.
To build this, what was a side hustle around creating content and ghostwriting for execs on LinkedIn into full-time. So I'd love to grow that into a stable thing that I support my family with. I would love for this podcast to be Joe Rogan and Joe Mackay.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I think they're probably the two big ones. I've built a niche for myself as a content creator on LinkedIn and kind of helping people share their thoughts on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And have the opportunity to talk to more really smart people and get into the deep conversations I love having through my podcast.
Okay, so this is great. So let's now have a look at your LinkedIn through that lens. So the first thing that jumps out to me is, obviously we've got the Thought Follower podcast. You're putting that forward by putting that in the banner as being the core priority. So I would then make the assumption that is where you want your kind of customer funnel to start, is that they start following you on your podcast and then they become clients from a ghostwriting perspective. So you really need to consider if you want that to be the priority, or if the priority is more the content creation and ghostwriting for execs on LinkedIn. Because right now, you were very quick to say you're a content creator specifically for executives on LinkedIn, but that's not popping out to me just by looking at your page. I know that you've got those two goals as being the big goals for you, and you've put them forward as being equal, but you do need to consider which one might take more priority strategically, and then have a look at that. Your profile shot, you've got a buttoned up collared shirt, which has a bit more of a corporate appeal. When you talk about relaxed and positive relaxation, I'm not getting that in that image. I would rather see you in a much more relaxed style, if that's the message that you're wanting to portray. Because right now, having a collared button-up shirt is not sending that positive, relaxed kind of messaging. If you really want to take it to the next level and you really want to own your identity, then you really have to look at everything symbolically. And your clothing is a big part of not only what people think of you, but what you think of yourself. So right now I'm speaking to you, you're in a really cool t-shirt. I would assume when you speak to clients, are you generally in that style as well?
Yeah, I am. It's interesting you mentioned the t-shirt because this, I don't know if you can see it, but it says it is what it is. And,
I love it. Yeah.
I actually do consciously put this shirt on for my podcast.
Amazing.
Most episodes I'm wearing this shirt, and I kind of think it's actually the mindset I'm trying to bring into the show.
Perfect.
It is what it is. That is that relaxed, approachable, pretty chilled sort of mindset that I try and wear for the podcast.
Yeah. So that's what you want to do in your profile photography as well. You want to be putting that out there and really own that image and identity across all of the touch points on the podcast. Great in your interviews, in your profile shot, but even perhaps if you take some of your connections offline, you've got that same identity. So, host of the Thought Follower Marketing Ghostwriter. So your headline is not doing everything that it could do. Yes, I think it's important to have host of the Thought Follower. I would put podcast. So don't assume that people have seen your backdrop because, for example, if you pop up as a connection request, they are not seeing all of the context of your page. All they're seeing is that one sentence. So you actually want to have that as the Thought Follower podcast. So that's very clear to them that that's what that is. And I would have that secondary messaging as being creating content for executives on LinkedIn. Own that, lean into that, and make that a really clear part of your messaging in your headline. The Thought Follower as a name for the podcast, I'm assuming that lends itself and is a play on words for thought leadership, right?
Yeah, the idea is I'm the thought follower. I'm that listener. I'm that person that will ask a whole bunch of questions and talk to thought leaders. Perfect.
So maybe one of your hashtags could be thought leadership as well, to keep using that.
Yeah, that's probably how I'll approach it.
So I love that you're using your featured section. That's really, really important. What you want to put in your featured section is your website and a link to perhaps your pod follow link so that you've got those two things there. I'm looking at your about section.
So that's kind of my pitch to my ideal customer.
So what you want to start looking at your LinkedIn as is almost like a mini website. And whilst I understand the approach of speaking directly to your customer and talking about what you do, when we think about what personal branding is all about, the end game is to have an individual or an audience, a group of individuals like, know, and trust you. And in order for them to like, know, and trust you, they have to feel a sense of connection. In order for them to feel a sense of connection, you have to share yourself. You have to share your stories. You have to share why you do what you do. Why is it important to you? Why is it interesting to you? So that about section really does, it can still talk about what you do for clients, but I'd like to see more of, well, who are you and why do you do it? Yeah. I'd like to get to know you because that's going to help me form a better connection with you, not just what you do. Because if it's just about what you do, then it becomes quite transactional, whereas you want it to be relationship forming. This is what a lot of people have done. They use their LinkedIn like it's a resume, but when you look at it through the lens of, okay, if this is like a mini website, then you can quickly cull out a lot of the stuff that's unnecessary, with the idea being that when you want people to focus on certain things, it's much better to have less things for them to look at. You just have it be directive of what you want them to see. So get rid of a lot of those experiences, and you can talk about some of your big achievements in your about section. So if there's any notable achievements that you've had through all of those work experience, then you can just pop that in your about section. How's that feeling so far?
Yeah, it's good. There's definitely a lot to think through there. Like I think there's certainly room for improvement.
And that's just LinkedIn, Joe, because, that's one platform. And I only literally, before we got on this interview, wrote an article talking about when all of your influence is on one platform, that actually is what I consider to be artificial influence. It's really important to take your influence and make sure that you're touching clients on different levels in different places. If I was doing a proper personal brand audit with you, we would inevitably need to talk about, well, what's on your website and what are you doing there? What are some of the other strategies you're using? Partnerships, collaborations, traditional media. There's so many other things you can consider and do, but obviously we wouldn't be able to cover all of those off in this short period of time.
So one thing I'd love to, and I think will be of interest to the audience, is if we're, say it's LinkedIn as a platform and we want to be more conscious about our personal brand, but we feel as though if we're an employee of a business, even in senior leadership, balancing that want to kind of express and curate your own brand versus feeling like, well, what's the company going to say or my colleagues going to think about this? What's your advice to people in that situation who feel a bit restricted?
First of all, you have to take responsibility for wherever it is you've decided to work. And now I say that for those individuals who have the luxury of choosing where they want to work. And in some instances, that's not the case. They've ended up where they are. It's potentially just a temporary thing, but they have to do it because they have to pay the bills. And that's understandable. In that case, I would say find out what the social media parameters are. And if there are any rules or regulations or actual limitations to what you can post, just know about them so you know what those parameters are and you can feel a sense of confidence in whatever it is you are doing because you've checked off the things that you know you absolutely can't do. For the people who have had the luxury of choosing where they want to work, and I've certainly had colleagues and friends who work for big brands where basically it's an unsaid thing that you just don't do anything on social media. I would say to them, you have to honor that. But just remember that building a personal brand isn't just about social media. Social media is one channel. It's one strategy, but it's not everything. There are lots of other things you can do to build a personal brand that doesn't involve social media. So I would say to those people, don't have it be in your mind, oh, I can't do anything because social media is off the table. Well, no, I don't know of any company that says you can't build relationships and even potentially use your LinkedIn as a way just to create connections and establish that first starting point. But do other things to continue to build your brand. It might be speaking, it might be through emails, it might be through networking. There's other strategies that you can put into play.
Do you see yourself as a thought leader?
I do. Yeah, I do. If you had have asked me 5 years ago, I would have said no. Now, I had all of the intel, I had the knowledge, I had the experience to share my thought leadership, but I didn't have the courage to really lean into that. And it's taken a long time for me to get to the point where I can very easily and quickly answer that question. And I remember the first time that I posted an article, and it would have just been on Facebook, and I'm pretty sure I had maybe 3 people read it. But I felt physically ill. Like I felt like I wanted, and this was after having put clients on the covers of magazines and featured on some of the biggest TV shows in the world. Here I was putting out a small thought leadership article and I felt like I wanted to vomit. So I really understand and recognize the internal hurdles that stand in the way of an individual putting themselves out there and just owning their thought leadership. And I always like to flip it, Joe, and say thought leadership is about leading thought. And so when you just focus on doing what you need to do to lead thought intentionally and with a service-oriented mindset, then you don't worry about the label of becoming a thought leader, because that can be a bit insufferable. It can feel very irksome for a lot of people. Don't worry about that. Just focus on leading thought and doing what you can, knowing that how you say something, why you say it is always going to be different to how somebody else says it, even if you're talking about exactly the same thing.
It's an interesting approach. I believe we are all thought leaders, and for me, what changes is just the scale of influence. Like sitting around the family dinner table, you might say something that leads thoughts and leads some conversation. The 3 people that read your first article.
Yeah.
And then you kind of scale up from there. So in your case, where did that courage come from? What changed it for you?
just action, just consistent action. It was, doing it once and then going, oh, I didn't die, so I'll do it again. And just continually doing that. And look, along the way, I received that external validation that put a little bit of wind under the proverbial wings, and it inspired me to keep going. And I think that external validation is helpful. Not that I would ever encourage people to measure themselves entirely and only on that external validation. And certainly in the beginning, when it can feel like, and you genuinely don't have an audience, in the beginning, it does take time to build up. Once I started to get a little bit of external validation, I thought, oh, well, this is actually helpful. And it could have just been somebody sending me a message saying, oh, I really loved your article. And I've kept every single one of those messages, whether it was an email or a text, I've taken a screenshot and I've put them all into a folder. So whenever I'm feeling a bit scared or my inner introvert is trying to have its way with me, I'll go back to the folder and I'll go, oh, okay, maybe I'm not reaching millions of people, but the 15 people I'm reaching with this article can really be helpful to them. And that's what I'll focus on.
Yeah, I love that. So important to remind yourself of some of those positives. What do you've shared with us your kind of 3 to 5 year goals and where you want to be. So what do you measure yourself on in the achievement of those?
I always look at, well, who am I and what am I attracting into my life? So what opportunities, what people, what connections am I creating? And that to me is the measure and the yardstick that I look at. Vanity metrics, do they play a part? Well, at some stages they did. Just recently, LinkedIn changed its algorithm and it changed a lot of people's reach.
Yeah.
And the vanity metrics that they were receiving dramatically changed. So whilst I was getting all of these amazing vanity metrics and this amazing response on LinkedIn, then the algorithm changed and it was like, oh, it's, a bit underwhelming. And that was a great reminder for me to check back in and go, it's not about that. Who am I attracting into my life? What opportunities am I attracting into my life? And quality over quantity. And that's what I look at.
Hey, it's me again. If you made it this far, I'm guessing you're enjoying the chat. Don't forget to give the Thought Follower a rating and share it with your friends. Otherwise, reach out to me on LinkedIn with any guest suggestions or feedback on the show. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get back to the episode. There's one other thing I saw that you work with people on is their presence and gravitas.
Yes.
What's your number one tip for building gravitas?
Oh my God, that's a hard question.
Yeah.
But what the research shows, and I even interviewed Dr. Rebecca Newton on my podcast, and she wrote the book Authentic Gravitas. And there's another great book called The Charisma Myth. And Olivia Fox-Cabane talks about the 3 elements of what it really means to be charismatic. And in both of those ideas, gravitas and charisma, it's really about people taking notice of you and people listening when you speak, people being attracted and you having that magnetic pull on people wherever you go. What is interesting is it's really not about you at all. It's your ability to focus on, be present to, and care about the people that are around you. That's what makes them want to listen to you. That's what makes them want to follow you. It's actually more about them than you. So when you go into any situation, so let's say you're speaking on stage, and if you were to walk onto that stage and just energetically be there for the audience and really focus on them and giving them the best experience and giving them everything you've got, that feeling that they're going to have in their mind, it's going to be perceived as, wow, this person is, has gravitas. This person is charismatic. But actually what it is that person is focusing on them.
Yeah.
So rather than thinking it's about, well, how well you're dressed and how, the way you're posturing, your body language and the tone of your voice. All of those things come into play when you start to think about the science of gravitas and charisma. But at the heart of it, it's about really what you're giving and being present to that, whether it's one person or a group of people. That's the most magnetic quality. So that would be my biggest tip, is when you have that sense of just presence and focus on an audience, whether it's one person or a group of people, that's going to make you really show up with gravitas and charisma.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because one other thing that I've been looking at is, and something I'm working on for myself, is listening.
Yeah.
And I think to your point around what's, how do you stay present for people and give them your attention and kind of be with them? I think asking good questions and then listening, genuinely actively listening, also in my experience has been something I've actually used as almost a coping mechanism. Like, I'm quite introverted, and if I'm meeting new people, I don't want to be the one on the stage, holding court and telling great stories.
Yeah.
But asking a question and then sitting back and listening intently, and then kind of showing that you've listened by continuing to ask, like follow along with the story, I guess, and go deeper, I think is something I've noticed that has helped me engage better with people as well. What do you think about that?
Well, the research backs that up entirely, Joe. The research shows, and I believe it was a study done at Harvard, shows that by asking thoughtful questions, that someone will see you as being more charismatic. So it's one of the things that I talk about when I talk about the skills and strategies that an individual would want to work on in order to become more charismatic and to show up with more gravitas. Active listening and asking thoughtful questions, and also the 2-second pause where you show a person that you've actually listened to what they've said by just taking a moment before jumping straight in with a response. The research shows that that is very much charismatic behavior.
Okay. Interesting. So what's the best way for people to follow along with your journey and stay in touch with what you're doing?
My website would be the best place to go. So it's carlilyon.com.
Cool. I'll drop the link in the show notes as well.
Thanks,
Carlii, thank you
Joe.
so much for having a look at my personal brand and for all your advice and your wisdom.
My
It was
pleasure.
really good to chat to you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to support me or the show, best way is to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And please get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Love to hear from you with any guest recommendations or feedback on the show. See you on the next one.